What if scenarios can be fun to explore in Star Wars, like what if the CIS had somehow been able to win the Clone Wars, what if Mace had killed Palpatine, and what if Obi-Wan were brave enough for politics? But one hypothetical scenario that comes up a lot is what might have allowed the Empire to beat the Rebels, and recently I kind of joked about one idea, one that gets thrown around a lot, which is that the TIE Defender being invested in instead of the Death Stars could have made the difference. In canon, this is an actual debate which happens within the Empire, with characters like Thrawn advocating more heavily for the TIE Defender over Project Stardust and the Death Star's development pushed for by Tarkin. But even in the Legends timeline, this was something at least debated by fans on whether a different allocation of resources, or using more of a specific ship, might have won the Galactic Civil War for the Empire. Aside from the usual angle of fascist regime would win if they simply made a better weapon, the argument for the TIE Defender is pretty similar to the argument for another ship often thrown about as a potential military panacea for the Empire, the Lancer-class frigate. In both cases, it's basically suggested as an answer to the Rebels' use of fighter craft to achieve some of their most notable victories, particularly exemplified by Yavin and Endor, where a lack of fighter superiority, or anti-air, meant the Empire wasn't able to destroy the Rebel fighters attacking each of the Death Stars. But you also can't just look at it as saying they should have had more of something, because sure, if you just gave the Empire more resources, they'd have more to work with, and naturally that would mean expanded capabilities and a harder job for the Rebels, even if it doesn't mean a win in the end. You have to look at it from the perspective of what they're being done instead of. In the case of this recent tweet in the in-universe debate in canon, the answer to that is already given. You're doing it instead of the Death Stars. And while I think this probably does improve the Empire's chances a bit, I don't think it's improved because of the actual power of the Defenders or Lancers per se. The destruction and really even the creation of the Death Stars, aside from being big military and economic strikes for the Rebellion, were massive wins for the Rebellion in the area which actually mattered most politically. In the Legends timeline, there was a museum set up on Coruscant filled with propaganda, claiming the Death Star was a mining platform blown up by the Rebellion in a terrorist strike. But even if we don't know how the general public responded to any of this, there was a lot of competition between the Imperial fleet who felt the Death Star took away resources from them, like Thrawn expresses in canon, to some extent with the TIE Defender and Death Star debate, although it exists in Legends as well, and then Tarkin's political devotees on the other side, who saw the Death Star as the center of their new power. The aggrievement this led to within the fleet would certainly spur some defections, especially for any officers who may have bought into the idea that they were still a force for peace and were uncomfortable with having created the Planet Destroyer 9000. Shortly before Yavin, for example, General Crix Madine's defection to the rebels was prompted by the release of a plague on Dental. Even within the Imperial fleet's leadership, many of whom had little regard for the Outer Rim and its inhabitants, the destruction of an ancient human stronghold in the core, like Alderaan, was going too far, and many of them, who had begun their Imperial careers fighting against sedition painted as a continuation of the CIS, began to feel increasingly uncomfortable with the expanding scope of their atrocities. This happened with Crix Madine, like I mentioned, but it's also how other generals like Yondo Donna ended up in the rebellion. The news of the Death Star's completion was dispiriting to the Rebellion as an organization, as we see in canon with the panic responses at Yavin and Rogue One, but ultimately it is something that they overcome, and I don't think we can take that scene to mean that had that conversation gone a bit differently, everyone was about to pack up, go home, and never oppose the Empire again. The point of the Death Star is to instill fear, but the fear of being killed for engaging in rebellion eventually would get overridden by people realizing that the noose just keeps tightening. If loyalists on Alderaan can be destroyed to take out a small cell or a rebellious senator, then is anyone actually safe? And if nobody ends up being safe, then how does the order that the Empire claims to be operating and committing these atrocities in the name of actually exist? As Leia says,
"The more you tighten your grip, Tarkin, the more star systems will slip through your fingers."
But from a military perspective, what does the use of extra Lancers or TIE Defenders open up? The Empire would have been able to spread more fleet resources to protect important targets across the Empire, whether that's related to military production, administrative capacity, or anything else, and that's really where the Empire's strength did lay. The Imperial fleet was numerous enough with its Star Destroyers, TIE Fighters, and billions of other craft to keep reasonable local forces in most sectors. If you take the Death Star's resources and turn that into more local TIE Defenders, you could very well increase the ability to respond to the Rebellion's guerrilla strikes. The rebels were explicitly not trying to fight the Empire on even footing after some early setbacks, so I don't think it makes sense in most instances to talk about how the presence of a different type of craft may have changed the battle, since, except in defensive actions, it would just mean different areas at different times became the new rebel targets, albeit in a more limited capacity because of the wider capacity of the Empire's defenses. And this is where we get to the alternative option of giving the Empire more TIE defenders, where they cut back on the worst TIE fighters to have a smaller number of higher quality fighters. This again may have meant they win more individual engagements, especially since it allows pilots to survive long enough to get at least a little bit better at their job, but it means covering fewer areas. You could have the TIE defenders present for high-value battles like Yavin and Endor, but you're also leaving more worlds undefended, allowing those populations the freedom to organize against the Empire by liking this video and subscribing for more. One of the repeated themes that large factions in the Star Wars galaxy face is that the government of the day struggles with being stretched too thin to defend everything at once. This happens to a notably disastrous degree in the New Jedi Order series, after the New Republic's early inaction allows the Yuuzhan Vong to gain a foothold in the galaxy. And then the exact same problem occurs in the same war, only in reverse, with an equally thin Yuuzhan Vong empire after they'd won most of the war. Palpatine's empire's ability to monopolize force and have at least some token force everywhere was essentially their answer to this. The value in having 3 TIE fighters in 3 different places was much higher than 1 TIE defender in one place, even if you could argue a TIE defender would mean a higher chance of winning a battle when it does occur. The secret to what they were trying to do was to make sure that those battles didn't happen in the first place, and then it doesn't matter how trash your fighters are. When it came to fighting insurgencies, the Empire needed to rely on its ability to spread out, so there's only so much an improved bit of tech you could only field in more limited amounts could do to help them. A lot of emphasis gets put on Yavin and Endor in these hypotheticals, but TIE defenders and Lancers aren't necessarily going to do a better job of chasing Wedge and the Falcon through the second Death Star, and the Rebel fleet could still have taken down the Executor, even fighting against better fighters, especially if there were fewer of them. They still needed to make sure they had warm bodies everywhere, and the biggest mistake the Empire could make is allowing the Rebels to have a decisive battle at all. So more than anything, I think these kinds of discussions of what military tools the Empire could use to win the war ignores something pretty important, the reason they actually lost. The Empire did not lose the war militarily, so plugging holes in its military only gets you so far. When the secession worlds rose up before Yavin, the Imperial Navy, as it existed, terrible fighters and all, managed to easily crush them. The lack of the Death Stars may remove 2 big targets for the rebels to take down, but because of the nature of the Imperial state, it was always going to hinge on one specific target, Emperor Palpatine. Palpatine had built the Empire in such a way that he was the center of power, pitting group against group as he'd done with the political leadership and the fleet with the construction of the Death Star, and of course in millions of other smaller examples throughout the galaxy. When the Battle of Endor occurred, the Rebels' fleet power was barely around 3% of the Empire's, and the rebellion was far from being able to make any true headway in establishing their own government, or really challenging the Empire in most pitched battles. Their guerrilla strikes had caused some damage, and they had some momentum in recruitment, but they were still far from a position where they were actually going to challenge the Empire head-to-head. Maybe they would have gotten there eventually, and maybe the TIE Defender being used more or Lancers being used more would have delayed that, but it wasn't how they ultimately did win. So looking at changes in tactics and armaments as a way to change the overall outcome is like rearranging the deck furniture on the Executor. The key event at Endor wasn't the destruction of the second Death Star on its own, which would have really just been another Yavin, as painful as that was, or the loss of the Executor and its beautifully rearranged deck furniture. It was Palpatine going down that shaft, and that happened not because of the comparative power of the Rebel military, but because Luke was able to push Vader to do what the Sith had already been doing for millennia, kill his master. Without Palpatine, even if the Rebel fleet had been routed at Endor and forced into retreating, and Endor had somehow been salvaged as an Imperial victory, the real defeat of the Empire came from its fracturing without Palpatine to hold it together. A fleet of extra TIE Defenders would just mean more expensive Imperial hardware out there blowing each other up. Nobody, not even Vader, was in a true position to unite the Empire, despite certain claims by central committees of Grand Moffs that possessing his gloves might mean that you were allowed to rule the Empire, and yes, that's a real plotline. As we see in episode 4, many within the Empire didn't really respect Vader the way they did Palpatine, even if those under him in the fleet feared him. Realistically, if anyone had established themselves enough to unite the Empire politically without Palpatine, it was probably someone or combinations of someones on the first Death Star, like Tarkin. Not having a Death Star to focus this power on, or being able to discourage some other Rebel strikes with higher quality fighters and anti-fighter, may very well have made the Rebels' job more difficult. I'm not going to deny that, but it doesn't address the core rot which put an expiration date on Palpatine's regime in the first place. That's going to do it for today's video. I hope you've enjoyed it. Remember to like and subscribe for more, and to leave a comment if there's another topic you'd like to see covered on the channel. Thank you for watching, and special thanks to the patrons whose names you're seeing on screen right now for making this kind of video possible.